Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Q3 edition of our Global Risk Outlook. For those that haven't joined one of these webinars before, the session is going to be an opportunity to hear directly from our intelligence analysts about the developments that they believe organisations should be paying attention to right now. So let's introduce you to the speakers today, and we'll start by going around the room. Let's start with you, Julian.
Hi, I'm Julian, and I'm a senior intelligence analyst here at Solace Global.
Hi, I'm Josh, and I am an intelligence analyst here at Solace.
Hello, I'm Manfredi. I'm an intelligence analyst here at Solace.
Thank you. And moderating today, my name is Amy Stone. I'm head of marketing at Solace Global Risk. So we're covering three topics. Julian will be exploring systematic strikes in Ukraine and critical interceptor shortages. Manfredi will then discuss the key risks and emerging trends that we're monitoring across Latin America. And finally, Josh will explore El Niño with a particular focus on the potential for global disruption, the associated security risks, and the practical steps that businesses can take to prepare. Now, you might notice that the Middle East is not covered in today's agenda. Having covered the region in our previous two webinars, we wanted to create some space for other developments, but we have continued to monitor the situation in the Middle East closely, and our intelligence team publish updates twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, and we'll share a link so you can access the latest analysis on our website. So with that, let's begin. Julian, I'll hand over to you. Could you just give us a broad overview of the current situation on the war in Ukraine and specifically how the air war has intensified?
Of course, Amy. So this time last year, actually, in the Q3 2025 webinar, I actually also spoke about Ukraine and a similar issue when I spoke about how rising Russian missile production was enabling far larger scale strike packages against Ukrainian cities. Now, that trajectory has not only continued, but the situation has become considerably more dangerous, particularly in the last couple of months. So just as a sort of broad overview of these issues, firstly, the ground picture. Well, Russian frontline advances have slowed markedly in the past year. It's not quite a stalemate. I think it would be fairer to say that Ukraine is just losing ground very slowly. For example, beginning particularly through June, a very highly important component within the fortress belt in our unoccupied Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces were increasingly making infiltrations in this city. However, Putin's given objective to Russian armed forces of taking all of Donetsk Oblast and its fortress belt by the end of 2026 is highly unlikely, really, to be achievable. Fundamentally, maneuver warfare on the front line has become near impossible due to the saturation of FPV drones on the battlefield. So this long-range strike war between both sides has become increasingly decisive. It's important to emphasize that Ukraine has intensified its own air war enormously, with real success on two separate fronts. Firstly, its deep strikes campaign, particularly against Russian oil refining capacity and military industry, but also its intermediate range strikes campaign, particularly in the last few months, on Russian ground lines of communication, particularly going into Crimea. But, and this is the topic really for today's webinar, for me, is that Russia's own long-range fires against Ukrainian cities have significantly intensified, with this threat becoming particularly acute recently. So this sharp recent escalation in risk is driven by two things that I'll talk about today. Russia's declared systematic strikes campaign and a critical shortage of ballistic missile interceptors.
Tell us a little bit more about exactly what is Russia's systematic strikes campaign and how has it changed the risk profile of places like central Kyiv?
The systematic strikes really began in its current phase with this unprecedented attack that was conducted on the 24th of May. So on the 24th of May, Russian forces launched over 90 missiles and 600 one-way attack drones. 36 of these missiles being ballistic, and at least one being the Oreshnik IRBM, which is symbolic primarily in terms of its kinetic effect, but symbolic because it's associated with typically being armed with a nuclear warhead, though not in these instances, of course. And this attack was primarily against Kyiv city and the wider Kyiv Oblast. Now, after this attack, the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, reported impacts in every district of the city. It was assessed to be the largest attack in Kyiv of the war by numbers of locations damaged in the war thus far. While particularly of interest for travel risk management, And from my perspective, it was the target set was distinctly characterized by massed fires falling on central Kyiv in areas that host foreign diplomatic missions, international organizations, and hotels used by the international community. Now, this was followed the following day by a formal announcement from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announcing that Russian forces are now going to deliver systematic strikes on Kyiv, explicitly warning that foreign citizens, including personnel of diplomatic missions and representations of international organizations, should leave the city. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov personally warned the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio to evacuate US citizens and diplomats from the city. Now, this really marks a genuine shift in the risk profile for travel and accommodation in central Kyiv in particular, because Russia had previously avoided massing fires in this district, almost certainly to limit the collateral harm to foreign nationals that would inevitably result, especially NATO state citizens, because this would raise escalation risks for Russia and also probably rally international support for Ukraine. Now, the explicit threats to embassies and foreign nationals show that Russian targeting is now materially less risk averse. This undermines the relative safe haven status Central Kyiv had enjoyed. And the campaign has continued while no single attack has been as distinctly characterized as by the overwhelming targeting of Central Kyiv as on the 24th of May. We've seen every 1 to 2 weeks a major Russian attack being conducted against Kyiv, with some attacks, for example, in mid-June, resulting in impacts on, for example, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Kyiv-Pечersk Lavra in central Kyiv. Now, the reason that these strikes are actually penetrating Ukrainian air defense so much, particularly recently, is the second factor I wanted to talk about today, which is that Russia is deliberately exploiting a critical Ukrainian shortage of ballistic missile interceptors.
Thanks, Julian. And let's take a bit of a deeper look at the shortage of ballistic missile interceptors. How has this increased risk in Ukrainian cities?
Well, really, the key issue is that Ukraine's only reliable means currently of intercepting ballistic missiles is the Patriot system. No Patriot coverage effectively means no defenses against a ballistic missile. And these interceptors that are used are very expensive, scarce, and very much drained in supply by the conflict in the Middle East. So each interceptor is estimated to cost about $4 million US, and you often need multiple interceptors to actually reliably intercept an incoming ballistic missile. The arithmetic is just quite unfavorable for Ukraine, because in the conflict in the Middle East that's ongoing and began in February, there are estimates, and these are outdated now, so it will be increased now, of 1,500 of these pack-free Patriot interceptors being expended by the US against Iran, which is potentially about 50% of the US stockpile. And this has actually potentially shaped even the current climb down in US operations we've seen in the last 3 days or so by the US. Fundamentally, production just cannot keep pace. Ukraine's estimated requirement would be about 2,000 a year, with Russia producing 120 ballistic missiles or so a month. So this really has conditioned increasingly worse critical shortages of interceptors in Ukraine. Interception rates have plummeted. So in May, during that unprecedented attack I spoke about 37% of the incoming Iskander-Ms, the Iskander-M being the main Russian ballistic missile that's used against Ukraine, were intercepted. But in early July, we saw a shortage develop effectively likely to the point of near exhaustion, because there were several attacks where zero or close to zero ballistic missiles were intercepted, with very high rates of civilian casualties as a result. Now, Russian forces almost certainly exploiting this shortage by massing ballistic missiles specifically, because in the past month, what we've actually seen, it's estimated that Russia launched more ballistic missiles than it can actually even produce, which shows how it's trying to exploit this shortage. I will note, though, that there has been a recent partial reprieve in the last week and a half to 2 weeks, because interception rates have improved, but which is almost certainly down to some things that President Zelensky flagged on the 9th of July, I believe, that a US interceptor delivery was arriving imminently. But this is unlikely to last. A critical shortage is likely to quickly resurface as Russian forces continue to launch these very large-scale ballistic missile attacks against Ukraine.
Do you think there's any relief in sight for Ukraine from the threat of ballistic missiles? And how do you think the threat is going to develop further?
Well, I think there are really serious efforts underway to try and address this fundamental critical vulnerability in Ukrainian air defense. So we saw in mid-July, following a coalition of the willing summit between Ukraine and its European allies, the launching of this new anti-ballistic missile defense coalition. And the flagship program of that is the Freya program, which has set a 12-month goal for an affordable mass-produced interceptor with multiple European defense companies, but also importantly Ukrainian ones, because they're going to iterate upon the domestically produced FP7X by Firepoint in Ukraine. But 12 months is quite far down the line, and actually that target is likely over-ambitious already. The nearest term uplift for Ukraine is likely to be the new generation model of the Franco-Italian SAMP-T air defense system, with the first battery expected in Ukraine for combat evaluation in late 2026, but its performance against Russian ballistic missiles is unproven, and the Aster-30 interceptor stocks for that system are themselves tightly constrained, actually more tightly constrained even than Patriot. Then there's the recent granting by President Trump, who is increasingly favouring Ukraine, of a Patriot interceptor license. So Ukraine can produce their own, but this would need tooling, certified facilities, supply chains across hundreds of suppliers. And even if this is done through, for example, German manufacturing, meaningful output on this front is unlikely to occur in the next year. And then finally, Lockheed Martin, who produces the Patriot interceptors, recently unveiled a much cheaper interceptor known as the ACE, but this is not due to start initial production until 2028. Now, all of these potential ways to ameliorate the critical vulnerability in Ukrainian air defense, none of them are going to happen quickly. I mean, fundamentally, I think it's really important to spell out that a ballistic missile is just really, really difficult to intercept. As shown in the graphic, what a ballistic missile actually does is it's launched on a high parabolic arcing trajectory, leaving and then re-entering the atmosphere, coming down at extreme, sometimes even hypersonic terminal velocity. And this makes them extraordinarily challenging to intercept. Moreover, the Russian modified Iskander-Ms, which, as I said, is the main ballistic missile that Russian forces use, now perform unpredictable maneuvers in this terminal phase. So more, as shown in the graphic, so more interceptors are needed per successful kill. And every new system that I've spoken about to try and counter this threat is going to have to cope with this really, really difficult problem set. So the bottom line is that the risk of travel to Ukrainian cities, including central Kyiv, is going to remain notably elevated through to at least the start of 2027, because none of these projects, although promising, are going to happen quickly. Now, where I think it will develop next is that as the winter approaches and the cold sets in, Russian forces will highly likely pivot back to what they've done in previous years, which is target en masse Ukrainian critical national infrastructure, aiming to cause mass energy blackouts. But if persisting interceptor shortages arise again, which assess is highly likely, that will make these objectives against Ukrainian CNI far more achievable.
Thanks, Julian. And clearly there is a lot more increased risk from Russian strikes. What would you say the key considerations are for anyone that is traveling to Ukrainian cities now?
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. I think that the first thing to highlight is that the threat to civilians is, first of all, just drastically higher. A UN report was published earlier this month that highlighted that in June 2026, last month, the highest number of civilian casualties were recorded in Ukraine since April 2022, and this is largely down to Russian long-range fires. So, in terms of specific traveller considerations, I think this is very much known by people that live and work regularly in Kyiv, but central Kyiv is no longer a relative, and Kyiv more broadly is no longer a relative sanctuary from Russian strikes. That this safe haven assumption that shaped a lot of prior travel planning in earlier in the war has been distinctly challenged, and this must be factored now into risk management. Then there's also the assessment that Russian forces almost certainly now hold a far higher tolerance for collateral damage to foreign nationals, specifically in Ukraine, particularly those seen as aiding the war effort. The systematic strikes messaging that I spoke about previously was explicitly directed at foreigners. Then there's the short warning time of ballistic missiles. From launch till impact, this can be as little as 2 to 4 minutes. Now, the practical implication for this is that for a ballistic threat, although they may detect the movement or launches earlier, but because it can be as low as this time, you might not be able to actually reach a shelter in time. So pre-positioning, where you sleep and work relative to a hardened shelter, matters far more now. The timing of attacks generally, well, they still generally happen at night, but no longer exclusively at night, as we saw in earlier phases of the war. Firstly, strikes could bleed into the following morning, particularly large-scale ones, but Russia has on a few occasions, relatively rarely, but on a few occasions, launched significant daytime attacks, likely to actually challenge the idea that in daylight is inherently safer. And then in terms of what triggers these attacks and the cadence of them, well, as I said, there's been roughly one major attack per 1 to 2 weeks in recent months, particularly targeting Kyiv. But intelligence and situational awareness still matter enormously, because the largest attacks tend to follow identifiable triggers. These include major international summits and meetings of Ukraine's allies. This has often been followed by a major Russian attack, and particularly large or damaging Ukrainian strikes into Russia, especially those that cause a fair amount of Russian civilian casualties. Finally, the US Embassy and President Zelensky himself, or the mayor of Kyiv, will occasionally give warnings. The US Embassy in particular will give a warning if US intelligence observes that an Oreshnik IRBM is going to be used. Now, the actual kinetic effects of this weapon are relatively minimal in comparison to just a Russian ballistic missile, but this weapon's use symbolically being laid into particularly large-scale attacks means that it's important to monitor these embassy warnings, and if one is issued, to heed its advice very, very strictly. So in conclusion, I think the threat in Ukrainian cities is elevated, it's increasingly directed at a foreign presence, and it's highly likely to persist through at least early 2027. Now, travel does remain possible, but it requires constant threat monitoring and a greater level of caution, particularly when choosing accommodation and the like.
Thank you for such a comprehensive review on the situation in Ukraine. Now, on to our next topic, and I will hand over to Manfredi. Could you just introduce the subject? What is important about current US involvement in Latin America?
So currently the geostrategic system in Latin America is changing. The region is becoming more important globally, and a lot of these changes are due to renewed US interest in the region. The current administration, the second Trump administration in office since January 2025, has put more attention and resources into LATAM than basically any other administration in the past 40 plus years. The administration has also adopted a rhetoric that reminds us of long-standing tropes in US politics, including gunboat diplomacy, but most importantly, the so-called Donroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is Washington's sphere of influence and foreign powers should not try to establish a foothold there. So the current US interest in Latin America is driven by several priorities. First, halting unauthorized immigration, which is a priority of this administration, but also previous administrations increasingly. Secondly, reducing inflows of narcotics. In 2025, the US reported a decrease in 14% in drug overdose deaths, and US officials have tied this to growing security and counter-narcotics operation in Latin America. Third, long-term energy security. This is due to several important oil and gas discoveries in Latin America in recent years, including Guyana and Venezuela, but also due to the ongoing Iran war and crisis of the Gulf that has disrupted fossil fuel supply chains. And also the access to critical minerals. Latin America is a mineral-rich region. For example, the so-called ABC lithium triangle between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile that accounts for roughly half of global lithium reserves. But most importantly, I would say, is ongoing competition with China. The US sees China as its main geopolitical competitor. And China has greatly expanded its influence in Latin America. Expanding trade in 2024, Chinese LATAM trade reached $518 billion, more than 10 times the amount it was 10 years ago. double the amount it was 10 years ago. China has expanded the number of so-called mega projects in Latin America, for example, and notably in November 2024, China and Peru opened a joint megaport that could allow shipments to China to bypass the Panama Canal from Brazil. And also China has expanded its military footprint in Latin America with the construction of dual-use facilities, such as space station in Argentina, but also through military exchanges and the sale of hardware to Latin American countries. I'll just point out that, as you can see, there is a map of that kind of shows the impacts of ongoing US interest in the region. We see an electoral map of South America in 2023 and 2026. And I will say the map on the right looks considerably more blue than the one on the left. And it's also still outdated as of today, because Peru's new right-wing government has been installed today, and Colombia also has an elected right-wing government. So therefore, in the next few weeks, this map will become even more blue, showcasing this ongoing political shift in Latin America.
How is Washington translating this renewed strategic interest into action across Latin America?
We would highlight three pillars of US intervention in Latin America. The first is that Washington is increasingly backing local leaders whose politics match its own. The pilot for this type of interest, of course, has been the government of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Bukele took power in 2019 and then was re-elected in 2024 in a landslide victory. And Bukele kind of pioneered this mano dura model, which translates to iron fist, which is an hardline model aimed at combating local cartels, and the US has increasingly rewarded and supported this model and the Bukele government in El Salvador. Since then, the US has expanded its support for several other governments and candidates in the region that espouse its views in terms of economy, geopolitics, and security. Perhaps the most notable one is the government of Javier Milei in Argentina. The US secured a $20 billion currency swap loan for Argentina, which likely allowed Milei to convincingly win the midterms election, strengthening his government. And the US has endorsed several other candidates. It's notable that since 2023, there have been 5 Latin American countries that have flipped from left-wing governments to right-wing, to having right-wing governments. In 3 of these cases, Argentina, Honduras, and Colombia, the winning candidate was directly endorsed by the US. The second pillar of US intervention is the increasing willingness of the US to use coercive tools. And now what we've most notably seen, we'll discuss Venezuela later, of course, but the most notable ongoing example is that of Cuba. Cuba has been under a de facto complete fuel blockade since January, since the US captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in Caracas. And this has created the most severe economic crisis and political crisis in Cuba since 1959. The intervention in Venezuela, of course, has been the most notable form of US kinetic intervention in the region. On the 3rd of January, US special forces captured Nicolas Maduro. This resulted in a change, not in regime, but in the government of Venezuela, and the new government seems to be a lot friendlier towards the US. And in this, we also see this shift between coercive tools and inducements with governments that comply with the US. The US has committed about $300 million, for example, to earthquake relief efforts following the severe earthquake that's hit Venezuela in late June. Of course, there have been other cases of coercion towards local countries. The US, for example, has used lawfare and increased tariffs against states like Brazil and Colombia. For example, just a week ago, the US increased tariffs on Brazil, and also at a point threatened to invade Panama over the Chinese interests over Panama's ports. Finally, the third pillar of US interest in the region is a growing anti-cartel and anti-narcotics alliance. The US has increasingly carried out kinetic anti-cartel operations in the region, and this has largely been a reflection to the growing power of organized criminal groups in the region. Mexican cartels have increased in power in the last decade. They've expanded to several different regions. There are recent reports, for example, Mexican cartel operations in Africa. Other cartels, such as the Colombian armed groups or militias, have expanded significantly, likely due to the failure of Gustavo Petro's total peace plan that Solace published a report about. And also other cartels from other countries, such as Tren de Aragua in Venezuela, have expanded significantly in recent years. So the most salient development in this US anti-cartel-led strategy is the creation of the so-called Shield of America's anti-cartel alliance in March 2026. This is an alliance that initially did not include the three likely most important states to collaborate on anti-cartel operations, which would be Brazil, Colombia and Mexico. However, with the recent election of the La Espriella right-wing candidate in Colombia, he's scheduled to take office on the 7th of August, it's likely that, that Colombia will also join this, this coalition.
And just taking a look at this more assertive US posture, what does this actually mean for the region's security environment, and what should stakeholders be monitoring?
Some key trends to watch in near future. The first one and the most notable trend that is likely or highly likely to continue in the near term is that mano dura is going to continue to expand throughout the region. Crackdowns against cartels will continue, will expand to more governments as more governments join the US-led anti-cartel alliance. However, crackdowns might not destroy criminal networks, but might instead displace them towards other countries where the security environment is less dangerous for them. This is the so-called balloon effect, and history teaches us that it can happen. For example, this occurred in Colombia after Colombia cracked down on the revolutionary armed forces of Colombia, or FARC, which pushed the narcotics trade increasingly into Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, but also after Mexico's 2006 anti-cartel offensive, which pushed increasingly violence towards Central America. So, for example, in a scenario where, say, Venezuela engages in growing anti-cartel operations, this could push groups towards Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama or Belize. Some of these states have limited capacity to contain these powerful cartels. So the net effect of this, especially for travelers, is that while crime, and particularly organized crime, might decrease in some previous hotspots, it might become more unpredictable. Firstly, because the imposition of stricter anti-cartel operations can have an impact on travelers, for example, growing police checks or limited access to urban areas. But also because cartels might become more violent once they're pushed. For example, in the case of Colombia, past case of crackdowns and cartel led to so-called episodes of narco-terrorism. So the second trend that we identified is that coercive pressure on unfriendly government will continue. The most notable case, of course, is Cuba, where the US seems content with continuing to apply maximum pressure on the state, but also another potential unfriendly countries in the region. The case that we singled out here is Nicaragua. Nicaragua has greatly improved its partnership with China since switching recognition from Taiwan to China in 2021. And although less politically important for the US, it doesn't have the Nicaraguan diaspora doesn't have the same political clout as the Cuban diaspora, and also it doesn't have the same symbolic value as contrasting Cuba. However, we might see more coercive measures being implemented towards Nicaragua. Third trend that we might identify is that strategic infrastructure might become a regional flashpoint of competition, of course, between the US and China. We've already seen that China and the US have clashed over some mega projects, such as, for example, the port in Peru or the ports in Panama. And this could expand to other forms of infrastructure, or maybe even mining and energy projects in the region. The risk profile here is mainly hybrid threats, including, for example, cyber warfare or sabotage. It's important that when we talk about this emerging trends, that this might change. The geopolitical situation in the region might change. There are several factors driving uncertainty that could significantly change the security environment in the region. We've singled out 3 here, but there are likely many more. The first is the US midterms. It's possible that the Republican government will lose control of the House at the US midterms in November, and this could result in a greater difficulty in implementing a more harsh or decisive agenda in the region. The second electoral factor, driver of uncertainty that we've identified, is the Brazilian presidential election. Brazil remains the major economic power in South America, and the current government, the Lula government, the left-wing government has pursued strategic autonomy and has in many cases clashed with the US. It's notable that the US administration supports the opposition candidate, the son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, in the upcoming election. If the elections are won by Lula, as current polls indicate, this could grant the Brazilian government greater mandate to pursue alignment with BRICS or a more independent foreign policy, and again destabilize the political and geopolitical environment in Latin America. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, is the impacts of the Iran war. Several Latin American countries are exposed to the negative externalities that have followed the disruptions of the shipments in fuel and fertilizers from the Gulf. And we have seen already protests in several countries over these fuel disruptions or the increases in the costs of fuel, but also the greater visibility of US intervention abroad might have a negative impact on the way the US is seen in Latin America. Recent polls by Pew Research Institute indicate that the US has grown in lack of popularity, has grown more unpopular following the outbreak of the Iran war in Latin America. So greater unpopularity of the US could become a driver for a renewed interest in left-wing movements and parties, potentially leading to a new pink tide. This is a wave of left-wing and center-left movement taking power in Latin America that we observed, for example, in the 2010s. So as we can see, there are several more factors, and the region is likely to face this growing instability factors in the near to medium term.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing those potential scenarios and the trends to watch. Now, on to our final topic. So over to Josh, who'll be discussing global disruption and security risks from Super El Niño. So Josh, what is El Niño and why is it so significant this year?
So on the 11th of June, the NOAA formally issued an El Niño advisory, confirming that El Niño conditions had developed in the tropical Pacific and were expected to continue. NOAA forecasters initially placed the chance of this event becoming very strong at around 63%. They've now since increased that to 81%. So informally described as a super or Godzilla El Niño, this cycle could be one of the strongest ever recorded. This is largely because it's happening in a fundamentally warmer ocean baseline than previous super El Niños. So in terms of what El Niño actually means, it's a global climate phenomenon that emerges from variations in winds and sea surface temperatures over the tropical Pacific Ocean. On average, it takes place between 2 to 7 years and typically lasts around 9 to 12 months. The most significant local effects are typically felt during countries' rainy season, where it can either intensify rainfall and cause flooding or suppress rainfall and cause droughts. So El Niño events have been linked to numerous security risks, including wildfires, floods, droughts, increased civil unrest, as well as economic impacts such as crop failures, fishery disruption, to things like conflicts and disease risk. So according to some economic models, the strength of this El Niño could cause a 15.8% surge in global food commodity prices long term. However, the consequences could take until at least the second half of 2028 to be fully realized. Two prior super El Niños, which occurred in 1982 to 83 and 1997 to 98, are estimated to have caused massive global income losses into the trillions.
So where exactly is El Niño likely to have the greatest impact?
So there's four major regions really. So in Latin America, El Niño typically brings heavy rainfall, flooding, and landslides to the Pacific coast, while increasing the drought risk elsewhere. Secondly, Sub-Saharan Africa typically causes flooding in East Africa, but drier conditions across Southern Africa and parts of the Sahel. In Asia, El Niño commonly weakens monsoon rainfall across South and Southeast Asia. And then in Oceania, Australia and parts of the Pacific typically face reduced rainfall, extreme heat, bushfires, water shortages, and lower agricultural outputs. So I'm just going to focus in on two of those regions for this webinar. So firstly, Latin America. In terms of flooding, Peru and Ecuador are by far the most exposed to this risk. from unusually heavy rainfall and landslides during the 2023-24 El Nino, which, as I previously noted, is not anywhere near as strong as this year's El Nino is expected to be. In Peru, there was heavy rainfall, flooding and landslides, which affected over 100,000 people and killed at least 70. The government ended up declaring its highest emergency level in several northern regions. It's worth noting that in 2026, an anticipatory state of emergency has already been declared in Peru. It's already also experiencing some economic effects. Warmer coastal waters are pushing commercially important fish into cooler areas, reducing catches and increasing operating costs for fishing communities. There's also a large drought risk in parts of Latin America, primarily the Central American dry corridor, parts of Bolivia and Colombia, and Argentina. Water shortages, crop losses, and reduced agricultural production typically result from this, which means that El Nino can undermine food security from two different directions. Firstly, excessive rainfall can destroy crops and infrastructure, and secondly, droughts can reduce harvests and water availability. However, perhaps most importantly for most companies, these pressures also create numerous secondary security risks. So reduced catches have knock-on effects on the economy. There will be higher fuel costs, falling incomes, and transport disruption, which could trigger protests, roadblocks, port disruptions, particularly among fishing and agricultural communities, many of which are unionized. So key point for Latin America is that El Nino is not only an environmental hazard, it can quickly develop into an economic, public health, transport, and civil unrest risk. The situation is similar in sub-Saharan Africa. So in the Sahel, obviously I previously mentioned, it creates dry conditions in the Sahel. Drought can delay planting, reduce crop yields, place additional pressure on pasture and water. This is a place where food insecurity has already worsened for several consecutive years. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in particular continue to face conflicts involving violent extremist organizations linked to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Further pressure on food prices and rural livelihoods could increase migration and intensify disputes between farmers and herders, which are a primary conflict driver in the region. The armed groups I previously mentioned, including JNIM and ISSP, are likely to exploit rising prices and dissatisfaction with military-led governments to further weaken the juntas and pressure local populations in major population centres such as the capitals, Bamako, Niamey, Ouagadougou. In East Africa, the primary concern is excessive rainfall. During the 2023-24 El Nino, flooding across Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia displaced over 4 million people and killed more than 350, damaging roads, homes, schools, and health facilities, while destroying livestock and crops. Similar pattern would increase the risk of flash flooding, displacement, humanitarian access constraints, transport disruption, and waterborne diseases such as cholera. In Southern Africa, reduced rainfall during the agricultural season could have particularly severe consequences and has been highlighted by numerous analysts as one of the ones to watch in terms of economic impacts and risk to livelihoods. The 2023-24 El Nino contributed to the region's worst drought in more than a century and pushed millions into food insecurity. Pastoral communities are particularly vulnerable because livestock is both a source of food and a form of household wealth. But of course, the secondary effects in sub-Saharan Africa is that El Nino is occurring alongside widespread inflation, high living costs, unemployment, and general dissatisfaction with governments. Obviously, we've seen waves of Gen Z-led protests in the last couple of years. Drought, food shortages, flooding, and weak disaster responses could therefore increase the likelihood of protests. The price of maize, which is a key staple in this region, is expected to double after this year's El Nino. It could also trigger mass migration and force governments to respond to these crises by raiding health, education, or infrastructure budgets. Latest estimates place combined economic losses at 10 to 20 billion in the short term.
And thanks for sharing just how far-reaching the impacts actually are. Josh, just how can businesses prepare for the effects of El Nino?
So there are four recommendations that I'll be giving. Firstly, they should conduct risk assessments that explicitly refer to the risks from El Niño. So pre-travel and operational planning should identify areas particularly exposed to flooding, landslides, drought, extreme heat or wildfire, secure accommodation and alternative work sites, viable transport routes, water and power supplies, and fallback options if and when public infrastructure fails. Obviously, El Niño does not produce the same effects everywhere, so organisations should assess likely impacts by country, region and season. Second order effects should also be taken into account, for example, food and water shortages, power outages, civil unrest, disease outbreaks, and things like communication failures, which result from natural disasters. The second practical recommendation I'd give would be to maintain independent climate and threat monitoring. El Niño obviously develops over several months, but its local impacts can change quickly. Government weather warnings are often broad, passive, or issued only shortly before conditions deteriorate. In countries that don't have particularly resilient infrastructure, they may not exist at all. Organisations should combine meteorological forecasting with travel risk and security intelligence to monitor flooding, drought and wildfire, transport disruption, infrastructure reliability, food and fuel availability, or civil unrest, for example. This can be done through private sector monitoring platforms and global operations centres, which can provide targeted alerts, two-way communication, welfare checks, escalation protocols, and direct support to affected personnel. Which brings me on to practical recommendation 3, establishing clear escalation thresholds. So while El Niño related disruption is often foreseeable, organisations typically act way too late. So pre-agreed thresholds should determine when to restrict or suspend travel, relocate personnel, activate remote working, change transport routes, close facilities, or in extremis begin evacuation. Authority to act should obviously be clearly assigned, so its urgent decisions do not depend on lengthy internal approval. And the final practical recommendation is to build operational and communications resilience. Flooding, storms, extreme heat, and wildfire can damage power, telecoms, roads, airports, and water infrastructure. Organisations operating in exposed areas should consider satellite-enabled communications, backup power and fuel, pre-positioned communications equipment, multiple methods of contacting staff and travellers, alternative transport, and contingency arrangements, as well as emergency supplies, including water, food, and medical supplies primarily.
Thank you. Now, that brings us to a close, but let's go to final thoughts from the team. Julian, let's start with you for some final thoughts.
I think what I didn't get to speak much about really was Ukraine's own offensive strike campaign on Russia, although I did briefly mention it, but it is performing quite remarkably. That intermediate range strike campaign that I briefly mentioned has led to traffic being down at least 70% on the main highway that goes to Crimea, and a state of emergency has been declared in Crimea. And in Russia itself, the fuel rationing is enforced in between 55 to 56 of the 83 federal regions of Russia. But ultimately, it's arguably simultaneously true that Ukraine is winning the air war it is fighting itself, but losing the air war it is defending. The issue from the perspective of travel risk management is that the success of the Ukrainian campaign against Russia is likely to lead to further escalation of the Russian campaign against Ukraine.
Thanks, Julian. And over to you, Manfredi, for some final thoughts.
I would just point out that in more of a longer term outlook, while the approach that the US is having in Latin America is contingent upon the strategy chosen by this administration, the factors that have driven renewed US interest in Latin America are here to stay, especially in the context of growing global competition between the US and China. It's likely that Latin America will continue to remain important for the US no matter who wins in 2028.
Thank you. And finally, Josh, any closing thoughts?
So we're already at a time really where there's high unemployment, cost of living crisis, and frustration with governments, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia, some of the worst affected locations by El Niño. The second order effects are highly likely to be felt in the coming years, with natural disasters almost certainly having a knock-on effect. So things like civil unrest will be ones to watch in the coming years following El Niño.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. It brings us to the end of the session. And as always, your feedback is really important to us and it helps us improve every webinar we do. So thanks again for joining us and to our analysts for sharing their insights. And we will look forward to seeing you in the next webinar.